Howdy, folks, and welcome to your storm chasing forecast show for Thursday, June 25th. I am Gabriel Harber, and fresh off his Chase-Cation, we are back with Coach Cameron Nixon. Cameron, how you feeling, man?
We are indeed. And man, I'm feeling great. I feel like this has been a rough and a frustrating year, but these past 10 days, my Chase-Cation went really well. I got lots of really good photos and really just a wide variety of good stuff on the plane. So I think I hit the jackpot in a relatively bad year and had a lot of fun.
Yeah, it looks like you got everything from some awesome structure days where you could
Yes.
just sit back and relax to some really intense in the moment
Yeah.
storm chasing up in Illinois. So you got the best of both worlds.
Yeah. There was a lot of intensity this trip. I would say it was not easy.
Very cool stuff. And I couldn't help but notice that you finished chasing the storms, went back to Oklahoma, and it appears the storms are actually chasing you now because
Yeah.
the risk area for today is, of course, set up just north of your home area.
I would say so, and this is actually not the first time this has happened. Just last year, the day I got back from my Chase-Cation, I went out again in Northwest Oklahoma, and it looks like I may have to do that today. So we'll
Yeah, I
see.
was gonna say, even though you're finishing up the Chase-Cation, I don't know if you can turn down something like this so close to home.
No, no, I have a rule that if there's a five hash in my home state, I'm there.
No, pretty. Now, would that count for the westernmost tip of the Panhandle?
Ooh, probably because I
Okay.
like that. I like that place so much.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
Yep. Dude, a couple days ago, that Amarillo storm almost did it. I was thinking of you the whole time I was watching it on radar.
yeah. But the mothership day.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, thing was lashed onto that boundary. It looks like we're right on the edge of the 2% here.
And I think we're going to be talking about latching onto boundaries again. So let's go ahead and just dive into
Yes,
today's setup, Cameron.
that was a really good segue. Yeah, so let's just make sure that we know what's going on in the upper levels. And as we know, this has been a very active jet pattern, especially down in the Southern Plains. I was chatting with my chase partner, Michael Sager. He's a Tulsa meteorologist, and to say that he's tired of this is an understatement. This is not what you want to see if you live in Oklahoma. This usually means some kind of nocturnal convection and or MCSs, or it's just otherwise impactful weather. And so this is going to bring a lot of storm chasers down here. You can see there's this subtle troughing here with some pretty strong flow for this time of year. Let's go down to 700 millibars, see if we see any semblance of a more obvious shortwave. Looks like you might, maybe arriving just a little bit early, and then you see it traversing through the area for the rest of the day. So maybe keep that in mind. It might be a little bit early of an arrival. At the surface, we're generally dealing with this remnant outflow and boundaries from previous yesterday's MCSs. You can see that's going to eventually stall somewhere here in southern Kansas as we heat up with the introduction of a strong low pressure here over the high plains. So definitely looking like our primary play here is something of a outflow induced warm front here, draped across kind of northern Oklahoma, southern Kansas. And if you look at dew points, you could probably see this as well as probably some semblance of a dry line shaping up later today, but a very diffuse one at that. You can see kind of the strongest moisture gradient is going to be along that warm frontal outflow boundary feature draped across this area where the five hatched is, unsurprisingly.
Hey, Cameron, I have a question for you while you have the dew points up on the map.
Yeah.
Is there such a thing as winds being two backed? If they're coming out of the northeast, can that actually ever be a bad thing?
That's a great question. I want to say no. I don't think we know enough how the very lowest levels here in frictional influences affect tornado genesis. But I've definitely seen, I think, what was his name? Is it Whitman, Nebraska? I don't know why I'm blanking on this. Back in 2024. Yeah, I think it was Whitman. It had this kind of northeasterly low-level flow, and it still was able to produce a very long-lived, strong, and photogenic tornado. So I think there's a time and a place for everything, and I don't really have an answer to that question other than probably not.
Yeah, that's definitely something I've learned. studying under you for the past 5 or 6 years is there is a time and a place for everything. I hear people talk about Crosswise Vorticity as if it's the
Yeah.
end of the world, and I just remember hearing some of the stuff you've said. But that is all neither here nor there for today's forecast, Cameron. I'll let you hop right back into it.
Yeah, but no, I think that's a really good point. I think a lot of people say, "Oh, look at the crosswise," or "Look at the southwesterly flow," and like it all. I hate to be a nihilist, but like it's just so hard to predict if that actually matters or not. And like typically, that is not the reason why something happens or it doesn't. Out in the plains, especially. So what I like is generally how much cape and shear we have. We saw our deep layer, our 500 millibar winds, and how strong of shear we probably have with that. But we also have this ribbon of higher cape here, again, that's going to set up along this boundary. So we could pluck a couple soundings north of that boundary. And you can see, wow, this is, man, that may or may not be contaminated. Let's pluck one a little bit farther out. Wow. If something like this shapes up with this really deep of a moisture profile, not going to be good for storm viewing, in my opinion. I think you could get some very high precipitation storms, especially if they start merging together. Could be a window for some more lower precipitation storms here, though, especially with this photograph. That's lots of low-level shear, some strong venting winds aloft. So it might be one of those days where a supercell goes up. Initially, it looks great, and then maybe becomes a little bit waterlogged. But I might want to actually consult the NAM 3 kilometer just to make sure the wrap is just not off its rocker with how saturated we are. Because I've seen that before. Kind of struggles to do the thermos right northward boundary. Man, same thing. Same thing with the NAM. Yeah, so very moist saturated. So we'll have to keep that in mind. Maybe I'll pluck a little bit higher up here. I'm on a tangent now, but yeah, this is not a super look if you're storm chasing the plains. At least for me, I like this drier air aloft. This might make things a little bit messy.
Now,
But
would our chasers
yeah,
out there want to position themselves in the notch if they're comfortable with that sort of strategy on a storm like that?
while there's still low precipitation classics, sure, storm motions are relatively slow as we saw. So that could be an option, but as storms grow upscale, I think what you're getting at is with that much liquid in the atmosphere, that might not be a good idea
Yeah.
as we get storm mergers and kind of conglomerations of storms.
The Chaser Academy is the best deal in storm chasing, and it costs less than a combo meal at McDonald's. Unlock instant access to exclusive storm chasing presentations, participate in live group coaching sessions, and get answers to all of your questions in the unlimited Q&A chat. Whether you're a beginner, a veteran, or somewhere in between, our expert coaches will help you take your storm chasing experience to the next level. Click the join button below this video or on our profile page and enroll in the Chaser Academy right now. So I know there was a lot of talk from the SPC and also the area forecast discussions about the exact placement of that outflow boundary, and there was a lot of concern that it was going to be shunted further to the south, which would maybe place it in a slightly higher end parameter space. What are your thoughts on that, and how would that affect the chase?
Yeah, that's certainly possible. I think as we're going to see, there's a wide array of degrees of recovery and where that front ultimately ends up. I think it is safe to say that the farther south it goes, the greater the cape is. Other than that, I'm not exactly sure how that's going to actually affect the kind of ceiling of the event. But that definitely is something that we need to pay attention to because that'll affect where it sets up. And as you can see, various models have a different idea of where the previous this morning's MCS is going to end up later on in the day, and even the speed at which it traverses across Oklahoma. And so the faster systems like these that are farther east, they will better allow for some of that recovery. But the slower kind of models like the HRRR here, we might not recover as much. So that's definitely something to watch out for. Maybe throw the NAM nest in there. Actually, oddly, not too enthused about keeping that MCS. So these could all be higher end scenarios for these systems that scoot out all the way earlier on in the day.
And then last question I have before I'll let you go into full-on Cam analysis here, Cameron
I
analysis.
am Cam.
Yeah, exactly. I get that kind of confused in my head sometimes, but with the steering motion for these storms being roughly parallel to how that boundary is supposed to be oriented from west to east, would that make it much more likely that once a storm latches on, it can just ride that boundary the whole way and stay fueled?
Yes, I actually think that it's a pretty good take on this. If we see, I'll just illustrate this again. We have our cape axis and our boundary is going to be probably oriented northwest to or west northwest to east southeast, something like this. And then our shear vector is very much the same. We have this kind of west northwesterly shear vector setting up later on. And so that is going to allow storms to, even though it's a thin ribbon of cape that's likely to set up later this afternoon, you get a storm to ride all the way down through that could utilize this high parameter space for longer. So let's look at some cams just to see the potential array of outcomes. We saw her, which was actually probably slower to recover, given kind of the larger and later MCS. We still have supercells forming much later on after this does recover. Oddly, pretty far north, I would expect, given this kind of a system, maybe to have this boundary sag just a little bit more south. You can also see some convection forming along that kind of diffuse dry line, which also might be an interesting play. It just might be in a more mixed and less moisture-rich air mass. Maybe also some storms popping up along the high plains. RFS has the system well on its way and probably not lasting as long as a HRRR does in this area, but it does not really recover enough to kind of pop storms along this boundary. You see some storms forming in the high plains. Maybe that dry line feature is farther west than the HRRR had it. Also in eastern Colorado, but not super hot on Oklahoma or Kansas convection. Look at the V2, kind of similar story. It really doesn't have this boundary up in Kansas, but it does kind of sag a little bit south. Maybe this is a scenario where that boundary ends up kind of intersecting with the dry line and you have a triple point play. Again, just it's really going to depend on where that boundary sags. But you can see most of the storms off that dry line are fairly weak here. And the NAM has a similar situation as a HRRR, maybe popping a storm along that triple point here in southwest Kansas. Again, maybe another storm in Colorado for your structure hipsters, and then some crappy storms along the dry line. So definitely, yeah, it depends on exactly where this front sets up, how it interacts with that dry line feature, which will govern where these storms set up.
All right, bonus for our folks who can't quite make it that far southeast. I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the High Plains hipster play. You've already alluded to it a little bit with some of those storms in Colorado. So, what should we
Yeah,
be looking for if we're hanging out in the Denver, Cheyenne, that area of the country?
Yeah, great question. And I think that's going to have to do with how much moisture we get up into the high plains. Maybe we can look at NAM for kind of a higher end scenario. But oftentimes, when you have these MCSs come through, this is what happened several times this week. You have this strong kind of easterly flow pointed back up into the high plains. And so, as you can see, this kind of results in this advection of moisture into the high plains, and then maybe you get a supercell forming somewhere in this area. And so, if you pluck a sounding in that general area, you get something that is probably a little bit drier than the main kind of triple point setup. And if you're me, I actually kind of this kind of sounding, right? It's a really good structure sounding. So if you did have enough forcing to pop a supercell out there, I think you could get some pretty good structure, probably better than you could in the main kind of five hatched area. But what you should be looking for is how high these dew points get. If we're really only pushing 55 degrees up against the high terrain, that might be an issue. But if we're 58, 60, 63 plus, somewhere in eastern Colorado, that definitely might be an encouragement to chase there.
Remember to check out those links in the description below and then watch another video.